Hi, I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and I'm here today with Dyer Supplier to dye a gradient yarn. And we are going to do this today by creating 5 connecting mini skeins and dyeing each one a slightly different color so we can get that gradient progression for a long asymmetric yarn. The yarn we are going to use today is the Superwash Worsted Merino yarn. This yarn is 100% Superwash Merino and it is so soft and absorbs color beautifully. So now let's go prepare the yarn. To create this gradient yarn, we are going to turn this yarn cake into 5 attached 20-gram mini skeins. Then as we dye each one separately into sort of an attached fade set, we will end up with our gradient yarn. Some things that will be really handy for this will be a little scale, some mason jars for the dyeing so you can dye all 5 of the minis at the same time in one pot, and a PVC pipe niddy noddy. I like to do this with the yarn in a cake form versus starting with the skein on, say, a Swift, because I like to be able to weigh it as we go. You will also want some scrap yarn to use as ties. I also like to secure each of my mini skeins with reusable nylon zip ties. I really like using PVC pipe niddy noddies, but if you don't have one, you can use some kind of box or really any container to wind your mini skeins. I'm going to start winding our mini skein around the niddy noddy. I like to keep the yarn cake on the scale as I am doing this so that way I can check and see how we're doing and how close we are to needing to start the second mini skein. When you are ready to tie off your mini skein, first I take the loose end and tie it around the yarn. Then with our scrap yarn, I will do at least 2 additional ties, making sure that there is one on either side. Finally, I like to use the reusable nylon zip tie to help keep these minis separate. This will make it really easy as time goes on for me to know, okay, this mini skein is separate from the next one. And now we start winding the next mini skein and continue until you have all 5. Now we are going to take the minis off of our niddy noddy. Here are the 5 attached mini skeins. Now that we're ready to go pre-soak the yarn, I have one other little tip. I like to take another reusable zip tie and string all of the mini skeins together. This helps keep things from getting tangled, but it also helps keep them in order because this order is going to be important because when we dye the yarn, we want to make sure our gradient is in the correct order. We are going to carefully add the yarn to some plain tap water and let the yarn pre-soak for 30 minutes. But you can see now how having this extra zip tie around will just help keep things organized so that way we don't create a massive tangle. We are going to create our gradient by doing some cereal dilutions. We are going to take a purple color and make a gradient of it, and then a navy color and make a gradient, and then combine them to create our final gradient. I added a 1/4 cup of a 1% stock solution of Jacquard Violet to the 1/4 cup of water. This is a very, very blue purple. So I added maybe around 35 drops of Jacquard Fire Red to make it a little bit more on that purple scale and get the color we see here. And this is going to be the color I start with for our purple. Now for our cereal dilutions. We have a 1/2 cup of total volume in with our dye and everything else has a 1/4 cup. I'm going to take a 1/4 cup of our purple mixture, add it to this 1/4 cup of water, and stir this up. Next, I am going to take a 1/4 cup of this more dilute mixture and pour it into the next 1/4 cup of water and stir that up. And we will continue this down the line. What this does is give us a color that is much less pigmented at the end than at the beginning and even the middle. So right here we have a gradient of just our purple color. And we could go and dye the yarn just like that, but we're gonna add that second color into the mix, into our fade. This time I started with a 1/4 cup of our 1% stock solution of gunmetal and added it to that 1/4 cup of water. And we are gonna do the same thing. But I did add a 1/6 cup because we might end up wanting one more dilution. So if we go in and take a closer look at our most pastel, which really does not have a lot of pigment in there at all, and compare it to some of these more medium tones versus the more concentrated that is super, super dark, this will help us blend the two colors together so that way we can create our 2-color gradient. Here is a sample of the 2 colors that we mixed, and so now we can combine these and blend them together. But before we get started, I do need to remove a 1/4 cup of liquid from our palest purple because otherwise this will contribute the same amount of dye as that one. And now I am going to combine carefully these colors. The reason why I like doing serial dilutions for combining 2 colors like this is that it makes it like you dip dyed the skein in one color and then dip dyed the other end in that other color, letting the colors blend in the middle. And so this gives an approximation of that without actually dip dyeing the yarn in, say, a blank form. Now I am going to pour these colors into our mason jars, but I am also going to rinse out the color that we have in these cups by adding a 1/2 cup of water to them and then pouring it in these jars. The minis have pre-soaked, and since we kept them in order on this zip tie, I know which order to add them to the jars. I do want to take a moment to loosen the zip ties that are functioning as ties on each individual skein. That way it won't act as a resist point. Okay, so I am now going to start adding them to these jars. And there's no acid in any of these jars yet, but you'll see how already the zip tie is coming in super handy as I lower the yarn into the jar. I can use the tie to help push it all the way in. And don't worry about the colors that are sort of in between yet. We will fix that as we go. One of the reasons for adding the yarn into the jars before we go ahead and add vinegar is that it helps us get that more even color. However, if you add the vinegar first, you might get something more tonal, which is also lovely and fine. And I'm using my hands to sort of manipulate the color up to these intermediate sections between the color changes. And we will do this more throughout the process. Now let's add some acid. Here I have mixed 3 cups of water with 3 tablespoons of white vinegar, and I'm going to add a 1/2 cup of that mixture to each of the jars and sort of stir it up. So this is sort of the equivalent of adding a 1/2 tablespoon of white vinegar to each of the jars. And by sort of lifting the yarn up and down as I add that color, it is also helping to add some color to and vinegar to these areas that are in the middle. And having more volume of water also will aid with keeping the colors a little more even. They're still going to definitely be tonal, but it'll be more even than it would have been if we kept the water level really, really low. Now we need to set the color. I have placed the 5 jars inside a pasta insert in my dedicated dye pot. If you don't have a large pasta insert, you could place, say, a towel or something at the bottom of your pot. If the jars sit directly on the bottom, then you'll hear a lot of rattling around, which can be a little nerve-wracking. And now I'm going to fill up the water level so that way the water level in this pot is just below the water level in our jars. I did make sure that all of these connecting yarn pieces are as high, oh, that one not, are as high as possible so that way they won't dip into the dye bath water. And now we will turn the heat on. It's going to take a while for the pot to heat up, even with things covered. So I'm going to go ahead and wait for 45 minutes and then we'll check back in. But if you start to see you get a really rigorous boil, you should reduce the heat. The water has been hot for, I would say, a good 25 minutes. I'm going to reduce the heat to low and be careful because the zip ties will be a little warm. The colors are starting to clear. There's a little bit of pigment left in our most concentrated purple, but the color is looking really clear in the navy and some of these more intermediate colors. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and add a tablespoon of vinegar to each of the colors, but I am going to turn off the heat on the pot. It is still really hot, and once I place the lid back on, it'll remain really hot for a while. So I am going to leave things in here for another 20 minutes or so to see if we can get the rest of this residual color to absorb. Let's take a look. And there's a tiny bit of color left, but most of it has absorbed. I'm going to let it slowly cool off so we can absorb that leftover color. The water in all of the jars has completely cleared. So now I am going to remove the mini skeins from the jars so it can cool more. But before doing so, I'm bringing my zip tie back so that way I can, once again, keep everything in order. Again, this helps just keep things organized and keep things from getting too tangled. But let's just take a moment and appreciate how beautiful and subtle these transitions are. Now that our yarn has cooled, we are going to wash it in some lukewarm water. This is to rinse out extra dye and make sure we're not seeing any color bleeding, which we are not. I'm going to go ahead and use a little bit of some dish soap to wash the yarn, rinse out the soap, and then I will hang this up to dry, and we'll come back and talk about how to turn this back into a full skein. Now we have our dry gradient of connected mini skeins, and we want to turn this back into something a little more manageable. Now, one at a time, I am going to place these skeins around my Swift, going in the order. I'm going to do this in the same order that I dyed them, trying to keep them from slipping off as I add new ones on. What I am not doing right now is worrying about the bridges between the yarn. Each of the sections still has ties that keep them separate from one another, and that is going to remain that way until we get ready to unravel each corresponding section. If you have a friend who will hold this one at a time, that can work as well. Now we are going to go and clip the ties from this first skein so that way we can start unraveling it and remove the zip tie from this round. If you find that your yarn is getting hung up because the yarn keeps getting caught on some of the yarn that is beneath it, take off the mini, sort of flip it around, and then you can be in a place where you can easily unravel that one. Even though we are on a Swift, this is fairly narrow, and standing above it, I can easily unravel the yarn. When we get to the next color, we will also go around and remove all of the ties, one layer at a time. And then check, and this skein is going to start unraveling smoothly. But again, if you find it catching, you could take off just that mini skein from wherever you have it and sort of untwist it, because everything else is still tied up. And you can easily separate the skeins from one another. And now we have our beautiful gradient wound onto the Nitty Knotty. The unwinding might be a little easier if you make your minis a little longer. So instead of maybe starting with this 1 foot Nitty Knotty, if you had a 2 foot bar in the middle, they'd be longer and you could actually open the Swift all the way. But this still works really well. And the final gradient is stunning. You could wind your mini skeins onto a warping board as well. There's many different ways that you could go about with the winding process. The main thing is that you have these connected mini skeins and you dye each one a shade that is slightly different from the one before. Now, you could dye them all completely different shades to get self-striping yarn where there's not really a gradient between the stripes, but it's a lot of fun and I love the way the yarn turned out. There are so many different ways you can go about dyeing a gradient yarn, but this technique is one that I really enjoy. What's your favorite gradient dyeing technique? Let us know in the comments below. You can try mixing things up by, instead of winding 5 mini skeins, you could try winding 10 gram attached mini skeins, and maybe even adding a third color into the mix to add just another level of fun to the asymmetric yarn. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and if you want to watch me play around with some more gradient techniques, you can find me on the ChemKnits Tutorials YouTube channel. Don't forget to head over to Dyer Supplier to check out all of their beautiful, affordable, ethically sourced bare yarn. They are releasing new yarn bases all the time, and you can find all 40 Jacquard acid dye colors over there, making it the perfect one-stop shop. Thank you so much for watching, everyone.